gonna stumble to the kitchen, pour myself a cup of ambition, and yawn and stretch and try to come to life. Jump in the shower and the blood starts pumping. Out on the streets, the traffic starts jumping with folks like me on the job from 9 to 5. Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. Barely getting by, it's all taking and no giving. They just use your mind and they never give you credit. It's enough to drive you crazy if you let it. 9 to 5, for service and devotion. You would think that I would deserve a fair promotion. Want to move ahead, but the boss won't seem to let me. I swear sometimes that man is out to get me.
And understudy as a woman's exercise. Behind every workout there's a story, and it's usually a good one. And you want me to hang your coat behind the chair?
They let you dream just to watch them shatter. You're just a step on the boss man's ladder, but you got dreams he'll never take away. You're in the same boat with a lot of your friends, waiting for the day your ship will come in and the tide's gonna turn and it's all gonna roll your way. Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. Barely getting by, it's all taking and no giving. They just use your mind and you never get the credit. It's enough to drive you crazy if you let it. 9 to 5, yeah, they got you where they want you. There's a better life, and you think about it, don't you? It's a rich man's game, no matter what they call it. And you spend your life putting money in his wallet. 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. Barely getting by, it's all taking and no giving. They just use your mind and they never give you credit. It's enough to drive you crazy if you let it. 9 to 5, yeah, they got you where they want you. There's a better life, and you dream about it, don't you? It's a rich man's game, no matter what they call it.
Hopefully, though, I'm grateful for whoever is here. So. Yes, I am. Yes. Thank you. I will share that in just a moment in my official remarks. It is. It's an audiobook.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I took you to an intimate
Yeah.
restaurant.
Kindle,
Then there was
hardcover, paperback, audiobook, European edition.
talk
Yeah,
about legends horizontally. Let's get physical.
I know.
I wanna get physical. Let's get
Well, I've learned since I published my book published how many people still do go to the library.
body talk. Let's get physical.
Oh, really? I haven't seen it.
I wanna get physical. Let's get physical. Let me body talk. Body talk. Let me body talk.
That's great.
Happy,
Yeah, yeah.
happy and good. Try
Right.
hands on the table. It's getting hard.
This was my first book. I'm a journalist, though, so I'm constantly writing, but this was my first book.
I'm sure you'll understand my point of view. We know each other mentally.
Yeah. No, I can't wait to get back to it. I have a few ideas for my next one that are percolating, and I love it. Well, you're gonna hopefully appreciate them, but I do, yeah. I'm sort of an every woman with exercise, which I think helped put me in a good place to investigate this topic, as I'm not an elite athlete by any means.
I was just telling my friend
Yeah. That's pretty common.
So we're just waiting for a few more people to arrive. It's kind of light today. I don't know where everybody is on a Friday.
It's okay. It's a weekday.
Let me just turn off my phone. I know some of our committee's going to be walking in.
Here, I'll scoot over for
Oh,
you to.
yeah. I'll wait another minute for people to walk in. Good morning, everybody. Just waiting for a few more people to walk in the door. I guess it's a Friday. People are doing whatever they're doing on a Friday.
Exercising,
Maybe they're in their workout classes. So I'd like to say good morning to everybody. Thank you for supporting our Jewish Book Fair, coming out to our community. I know these are very challenging times. We've got a lot to think about in our Jewish world, and we like to share and support our Jewish organizations and Jewish community, and thank you for being here. So welcome to the J72nd Annual Jewish Book Fair. My name is Linda Zlatov, and I'm a member of the Book Fair Steering Committee. And I've been a member for a number of years, and we've been bringing in just wonderful authors year after year. So the Book Fair would like to thank our sponsor, Ageless and Active, for its support. Thanks to all our generous donors who are able to present most of our programs free of charge, and we invite you to become a patron or sponsor as well. We'd like to thank the Schuler Bookstore, our community bookseller partner in 2023. They're right down on Orchard Lake near 14, near Whole Foods. And extend a gratitude to the entire Book Fair committee. Your dedication and efforts have made all of this possible. And we've had a wonderful lineup of authors, and we continue to do so throughout the week. Please pick up a Book Fair brochure if you don't already have one, right outside at the front desk. And please visit our bookstore after the program today. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Danielle Friedman. I've had a few minutes to meet her this morning, and also she has some family here, which her sister who lives here in Michigan and husband sitting up here in the front, and thank you for joining us. So Danielle is an award-winning journalist who specializes in telling stories at the intersection of health, gender, and culture. Her first book, Let's Get Physical, How Women Discovered Exercise and Reshaped the World, was published by Putnam Books and was selected as a New Yorker, Financial Times, and Amazon Best Book of the Year. Danielle holds a BA in English from Duke University and an MS from Columbia University, Graduate School of Journalism. Originally from Atlanta, where it's probably a lot warmer than it is here. She now lives in New York City, which is actually where I was born, with her husband, NBC News reporter Daniel Arkin, and their 2 sons. So following the program, Danielle will be signing copies of her book right outside the door here. So at this time, just please silence your phones and give Danielle a warm welcome. And I'm so excited. I've learned a lot by just starting this book this week, and it's very exciting and very interesting. So thank you, Danielle. The mic is yours.
Thank you. Let's see. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. As Linda mentioned, I'm Danielle Friedman. I'm a health and culture reporter. Let's see. I currently mostly cover health and fitness for the New York Times Well section. And I am the author of Let's Get Physical, which is a cultural history of women's fitness. Having some slide, please. Here we go. I'll start with the book's origin story. This is me around age 8, and this is my dad and I at the finish line of the 2016 New York City Marathon. Thank you. I'm a lifelong mover, slow runner, but proud runner. But it wasn't until I was getting ready for my wedding in 2017 that I ventured into my first boutique fitness studio. And it was in that studio that this book was really born. The studio was a bar workout class. I don't know how many of you are familiar with bar. It's ballet-based, very challenging, makes you feel really strong. But I also, as a feminist journalist and a health journalist, as I got deeper into these bar classes, I was just so curious, where did this come from? And to be honest, I also, as a health reporter, there was a lot of focus on the pelvis and pelvic tilts, and I was wondering, is this workout beneficial for women's pelvic health and sexual health? And so I went down a rabbit hole, and I discovered the story of Lottie Burke, the woman who created bar. So Lottie was a German Jewish dancer who fled Germany to escape Nazi persecution and landed in London in the late 1930s. And sure enough, she had invented bar in part to help women at the time connect with their bodies and their sensuality and their sexuality. And this was before, the sexual revolution even got going. She was really ahead of her time. So I discovered Lottie's story, and let's see if this will work. Oh, okay. I wrote about her for New York Magazine's The Cut. I was thrilled to see that the story went viral. I found that bar studio owners, instructors, nobody was familiar with these origins. But while researching this piece, I also was quite surprised to discover that nobody had told the bigger story of the history of women's fitness. In fact, at one point I went to talk with the author of the book on the history of women's fitness, and she didn't exist. So in that moment, so here I am. In that moment, it was a light bulb moment, and I became quite obsessed. And I realized that, for every Lottie Burke, who is just became this really Forrest Gump-like figure, lived 9 lives right on the periphery of history. Every other fitness movement had a Lottie Burke-like leader as well. And so beyond that even, beyond the characters and the women themselves, I also saw a much bigger, more profound narrative here. And it has to do with the fact that when my book began in the 1950s, women were still really actively discouraged from cultivating strength, from having visible muscles, from sweating. It was considered, unladylike, inappropriate. And throughout the 20th century, with the rise of the women's fitness movement, women really tapped into a larger sense of power and agency and self-determination. And as I say here, historically, women's fitness history has often been treated as kind of silly, as kitsch, as, neon leg warmers and the vibrating belts seen here, which were a real thing. But it's how so many women came to spend so much of their time and their money and their days. And so I thought it was worthy of really, of exploration. And this came to be the big thesis of the book. The story of a paradigm shift in how women came to view their bodies. So this is the story I tell, and I really tell it through the stories of the trailblazers that I write about. I use their stories as lenses into each of these movements that unfolded throughout history. And so today, I would like to introduce you to a few of these women and take you on a journey through the history of women's fitness, and just share some of my favorite stories and highlights from my research. I'm happy to see some nods here. So my book opens with the story of Bonnie Pruden. Bonnie Pruden, let me just set the scene. So it's the 1950s, the post-World War II era. strict gender norms were really in place after women had gone to work in the factory, and there was this fear that women were replacing men in society. And so women's magazines, culture really told women that they, if they weren't weaker, they needed to perform weakness. They needed to ask a man to help open the pickle jar and let their man win in a game of whatever they were playing. And so there was a lot of basically the gender norms were extremely limiting. And at the same time in this country, after the tumult of the war and the Depression before that, it was an era of what was called the modern way of life, with a premium placed on leisure and comfort and push-button appliances, cars. TV became a favorite pastime. And so this is the world in which Bonnie Pruden is emerging. And needless to say, it was not a culture that was very open to or sold on the idea that everybody that exercise should be a part of daily life. Bonnie was like, forget that. Bonnie was a champion rock climber and skier. She was a Broadway dancer. From the time she was a child, she would literally climb out of her second-story window. She had to move. And she was also a descendant of Davy Crockett, or so she told people, and she really took a lot of pride in that. So this idea at the time, there was this belief that vigorous movement would make a woman's uterus fall out. And she said, I've been to a lot of gyms. I've never seen a uterus on the floor. So she was very active, but it wasn't until she visited one of her daughter's PE classes and saw them sitting around in skirts playing circle games that had no physicality to them that she really became motivated to get involved herself. And she was horrified. So from there, she started teaching kids exercise in the neighborhood. Then she started testing American children, and this is a longer story that's in the book, but discovered that particularly compared to children in other countries who moved more as a part of their daily life, American kids were a bit weaker. So she took her cause all the way to the White House, and along with her research collaborators, presented her findings to President Eisenhower. And this is from Sports Illustrated 1955. That's Bonnie in the corner, one of only two women. But the magazine called this one of the greatest, maybe the greatest collection of sports stars ever gathered in one place. There was Willie Mays and Bill Russell. And so she presented her findings, and it led to the creation of the Presidential Physical Fitness Test. Let's see. Here we go. Whoops. So after this, Bonnie became a star. She became the country's first real women's fitness evangelist and celebrity. She became the godmother of women's fitness in this country. She had already appeared, after the White House, she landed the cover of Sports Illustrated, and she became a best-selling author. She was the first fitness presenter on the Today Show. And she opened one of the first contemporary gyms in Westchester. And she really just pushed this message that everybody could benefit from movement. Men, children, and women. And this was pretty radical at the time. I mean, there's one interview with, I believe it was Mike Wallace, who says, so you think after men come home at the office and have their martini, they should get on the floor and do, sit-ups? And she's like, yeah. And it was just sort of, it was considered quite absurd at the time. But Bonnie was also of her time. And so kind of as we see here, it's the start of these dueling messages that pervade women's fitness history and the industry even today. That, yes, movement, particularly for women, could make you feel good, could make you feel strong, but it was also valuable because it could help you keep slender and fit after 30, which the title, apparently it was going to be 40, and the publisher said no one's going to buy that book, so they changed it. Bonnie recognized that at the time, for women especially, selling strength for strength's sake would just never have gone over. So she pretty, sort of savvily crafted her message, couched her message of strength, including, women doing push-ups, women lifting weights, in this message of fitness being a beauty tool, that it could help you hold on to your honeymoon figure. And one of her favorite catchphrases was, no muscle, no curve. So this is not, as far as I know, correct, but the idea that if you wanted to have curves, you had to have muscle underneath. But that was a palatable message. So, Bonnie really laid the groundwork. She helped to push the envelope ever so slightly to make movement more acceptable for women. So we're going to jump across the pond now to London, back to Lottie Burke. After a career as a modern ballerina, Lottie was now in her 40s and looking for something to do, looking to make money. She was very bohemian. She had an open marriage. She was a very openly sexual woman. Everyone who knew her said it sort of exuded sexuality. And her friends told her, do what you know. So she opened a fitness studio, although she sort of loathed being called, at the time, a keep fit girl. She was an artist. And it was this basement studio, but right, near where the swinging 60s of London was starting to take off. And because of her artist friends, she quickly attracted this pretty amazing, very glamorous clientele. Joan Collins and the Bond girl Britt Eklund and Barbra Streisand once came by. And there was just almost nothing. There was nothing like it at the time. I mean, there were like military exercises. There were some very gentle, graceful fitness modalities. But this idea that women would go to her studio and shape their bodies and cultivate strength and connect with their sensuality was really unique. But the other part was that she was the right woman at the right time, because at exactly the same moment, the fashion designer Mary Quant was popularizing the miniskirt, and women were ditching their girdles and wearing fashions that exposed much more of their bodies. And so, for better and often for worse, women felt a new pressure to not just diet, but to shape their bodies in ways that were considered beautiful. And there's a quote from Ladies' Home Journal around this time that I always think about, where it was, it used to be that fashion was designed to flatter the body, and in this era, the body really had to flatter fashion. And so Lottie advertised herself as the place to help women achieve that figure. It made her very successful. She became a fixture of the swinging 60s in London. She taught to music, which was also new, and not just sort of organ music, but rock and roll, to the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and the music that defined the era. She's there with her daughter in on the right. And one of her students took her method, originally with her blessing, to New York and opened up the Lottie Burke Method Studio. And that basically gave rise to the contemporary bar industry. It's really kind of amazing. If all of the founders of the most successful bar chains today trained or had teachers who trained in that studio. So, back to the US. Women are gradually starting to move more, but mostly in ways that, again, at the end of the day, didn't really pose a threat to the social order or to men, because exercise was marketed as a way to make yourself lovelier for your man, even if it meant developing some muscle along the way. And then comes Catherine Switzer, who you see here, wearing number 261. Catherine was a college student at the time, and she discovered running as a girl. She felt it was her superpower. She loved how it made her feel, and she also had to weather a lot of criticism from neighbors. People would knock on her parents' door and say, "Do you know what your daughter is doing? She's running." And she was told she would grow a mustache. She would, there was this phrase, she would turn into a man. And she didn't care. I mean, she knew how she felt. She knew that and her parents were very supportive. So she's in college at Syracuse, and she wants to run the Boston Marathon. And her coach, who's a little bit dubious at first, is supportive. She enters the race. She was a journalism major with her initials KV Switzer, and she gets in. So she says she didn't even realize at the time, but the Boston Marathon was only open to men, actually until 1972, because there were really pervasive beliefs that running more than 2 miles at full capacity would damage a woman's body, again, damage your reproductive organs, and just lead to exhaustion. So she got in because of her initials, and she's about 4 miles into the race, and there's a press truck that's following the runners, and some of the photographers notice that there's a woman in the race, and one of the co-directors, the guy in the loafers and the suit, is riding with them, and they're saying, did you know there's a dame in your race? So he leaps out of the truck and he tries to basically physically remove her number and tackles her. And it just, because there were photographers there, in the end, as they snapped this whole incident, it really galvanized this cause. But it was, it was horrible for her while she was going through it. And at that point, she knew, I have to finish this race. And from mile 4 to the end, mile 26, it became clear to her this was basically going to be her life's mission, was to open up opportunities for women runners. And that's what she did. And so among her many other achievements, she helped to organize the first ever all-women's road race in New York in 1972, the Crazy Legs mini marathon. It was sponsored by the Shave Gel Crazy Legs. It just to show sort of how, basically for any kind of feminist gain at this time, there was often another element that kind of helped to temper it. And so her friend, a man who was organizing it with her, went to the local Playboy club and convinced some Playboy bunnies to show up at the start of the race. And there they are in their turtlenecks and white boots, which again made it less threatening to see a bunch of women using their bodies, for strength and power around New York City. But, baby steps. So around this time, we're now into the 70s. The women's movement is really taking shape. 1972, Title IX passed. Here's, Billie Jean King with Bobby Riggs, who she famously faced and beat in the Battle of the Sexes tennis match in 1973. And, the women's movement is basically, it's fueling women's interest in cultivating physical strength and a sense of bodily autonomy as well. I mean, even in the book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, there's a whole chapter on exercise and strength. So it fed into the women's health movement. And just, basically, cultivating that sense of physical agency. So this helped to fuel women's fitness. There were a couple other milestones around this time, and this is why, heading into the later 70s, we're starting to see just a fitness boom. In 1968, this book, Aerobics, by Dr. Ken Cooper, published. He was a former Air Force physician and a groundbreaking preventative medicine physician. And until this time, while some doctors would recommend exercise, there was also still a lot of fear, not just for women, but for men. There was in some ways more fear about overexertion than underexertion, about what the heart could take. Because there was basically no exercise science. At his Cardiovascular Institute in Texas, Kenneth Cooper conducted research that he then put in this book. And the big message was, exercise is not only safe for men and women, but it's really recommended, and here's exactly how much you should do. Today we know it's a little bit less prescriptive, but at the time, those specifics were really needed. This book became a huge phenomenon. He also coined the term aerobics or he popularized it. It was not part of the vernacular until then. There were a few other cultural and consumer shifts that also cleared the way for women to move around this time. And a really basic one was tampons. While they were invented in the 30s, it wasn't until the 60s that they really became mainstream. They were still, considered quite controversial for a while. I still don't understand the tagline on the. I mean, I do, but it says these girls. They've discovered the tiny tampon that's right even for single girls. Okay. Yeah. But they did make it easier for women to move, and the tampon companies really went all in on advertising them as key to movement. But my favorite innovation from around this time was the invention of the sports bra, which was then called the jog bra. So, let's just consider it's 1977. Women, while they weren't moving as much as they would be soon, had been moving there, for history up until that point without sports bras. Necessity became the mother of invention as women's running and other forms of fitness and athletics took off. Suddenly there was a big market. And the two women that you see here, Lisa Lindahl and Hinda Miller, and they're also running in this ad, they're the inventors, and it's a great story. Lisa Lindahl had discovered jogging in the 70s. She actually had epilepsy, and she found that going out for runs was one of the only times that she felt really safe in her body and free because everyone around her was very protective. And she loved everything about it except for the fact that it made her breasts hurt. And so she was talking with her sister on the phone after a run and said, I wish there was a solution. And her sister said, I know, they need to invent a jock strap for women's breasts. And so she enlisted the help of two friends, Hinda Miller and a friend named Polly, who was a costume designer. And they went through all these prototypes and nothing worked. And then eventually they thought, well, maybe we should take that concept literally. And so the first sports bra was designed from sewing together two jock straps. And if you ever want to see the originals, they're now housed in the Smithsonian. Yeah. So, okay, it's the late 70s, more women are moving, the book aerobics is a phenomenon, and this is also when we start to see the real explosion of aerobic dancing. There were a few aerobics pioneers who I write about in my book, and they started to kind of bubble up with their classes throughout the early 70s. But the most successful was Judy Shepard Missett, who is at the front of the room in these images. There is a great story about how and why she created jazzercise, but I will leave that for you to read in the book. More generally, with aerobic dancing, it was very, it attracted a lot of women who had no interest in breaking any gender barriers the way Catherine Switzer did, who were sort of just often everyday kind of mothers and housewives, but who had loved dancing growing up. And dancing also was very non-threatening, very traditionally feminine, graceful. Dancers' bodies were something that women aspired to. And so these dance classes began to attract, thousands upon thousands of women. And it also helped to really bring women's fitness to the masses. I'm sure, JCCs like this one housed early aerobics classes, and they were in YMCAs and church basements. And and so while, yes, it was dance, a lot of these women were, originally walked through the door to get ready for a high school reunion. There was at the same time, particularly in the backdrop of the women's movement, something kind of quietly powerful about bringing women together in a space where they were there for themselves primarily, and having them sweat together and move together, and just be in their bodies together. By 1982, Jazzercise was the country's second fastest growing franchise behind Domino's Pizza. And so it also created a lot of business owners. Judy Shepard Missett eventually did, she franchised Jazzercise, and it could provide a very good living. One of my favorite quotes from Judy about that time was that the women in these classes, while they weren't necessarily out marching in the streets trying to change the world at large, they were changing their world. And she heard stories again and again, and as did many of the other instructors I interviewed from this era, about women who, after they began to get a taste of physical strength, said it became empowered literally to make changes in other parts of their life, to ask for a raise, to ask for more of what they needed at home. And so it had this quiet but collective empowering effect. So the late 70s, early 80s also saw the birth of women's weight training. This is Lisa Lyon. She was a pioneering bodybuilding champion who became a one-woman crusader for women's muscle and for the idea that muscle and femininity were not mutually exclusive. And again, all of these I go into, if you want to know the rest of the story, I go into great detail in the book. But again, at the same time as exercise, as muscle, visible muscle became more accepted for women, it also became more expected. Exercise became like a requirement of womanhood. And it also became sexualized. And, this was a theme that I really saw throughout this whole history of movement and exercise for women being both a source of liberation and being sort of then basically co-opted to be a source of oppression. And as exercise became more expected, it meant that for many women, their experience of it was really tinged with feelings of guilt, of shame, of trying to achieve body ideals that, whereas in the 60s it was skinny, now it was skinny and toned and muscular and devoid of fat, and they became increasingly out of reach for women. I should also mention in that middle photo, gyms around the same time went co-ed. They had always been separate genders, or genders would have their own day, women would have their own days, and they became pickup scenes in a lot of places, these sprawling multiplexes, and again, it just sort of, it complicated in some cases women's, not for everybody, but women's experience of exercise. This is the era that I grew up in. These were toys that I played with, Great Shape Barbie and Get in Shape Girl. And throughout the 80s, this idea that a toned, fit body was a virtuous body took hold. Working out became associated with virtue and discipline and morality. And this even trickled down to kids, and so I think it's so in our culture, and this is a very American thing too, we really associate hard work with virtue. But as I'll get to, there's, for most people, it's a lot more complicated than that. You can have a will and not have a way. And so, these messages really created a pretty complex landscape. Getting back to the action, Gilda Marx. Gilda Marx was an early aerobics pioneer. She opened up an early studio in LA, and she was married to one of the Marx brothers' sons, Gummo Marx's son Robert, and immediately attracted a pretty glamorous celebrity clientele. Bette Midler, the female singers from The Fifth Dimension, she even had Sylvester Stallone stop in. So she had many claims to fame, but her two biggest are, one, you might notice in these pictures and in many of the ones that came before, women are wearing shiny Lycra workout leotards. And we largely have Gilda Marx to thank for that. This was one of my favorite stories in the book. So Lycra had been invented by the DuPont Chemical Company it was released in around 1961. It was invented to create a more comfortable girdle. which seems like an oxymoron, and it is. But before Lycra, it was rubberized thread, and it was, from what I heard, hellish. So they invented Lycra, they released Lycra girdles, and at first demand exceeded supply. But then this kind of curious and unexpected thing happened, whereas for generations women had been dressing like their mothers, and purchasing a girdle was just a part of womanhood. We're now bumping up against Mary Quant's miniskirts and jeans for women, and youth culture, and younger women had no interest in buying girdles. And I had some people share with me that while burning your bra was more of a metaphor, people really did, well, they didn't burn them, but they really did ditch their girdles. And so suddenly, there was a lot of Lycra with nowhere to go. And Gilda Marx, who lived in a leotard, she had been a dancer, and leotards had existed. They were invented by someone named Leotard, and but they were really meant for like prepubescent girls' bodies. They were made from natural fabrics. They were not supportive at all, and she needed something that supported her body. So she started working with DuPont and with dancewear manufacturers to invent this supportive but flexible, beautiful uniform of women's fitness. And she would test them out with her students. And it really took off from there. In many ways, leotards became one of the uniforms of the 80s. For many women, while I think today especially, but then as well, we could debate the merits of the leotard, and is it a feminist symbol? Is it, is it the opposite? But for many women who had grown up feeling really restricted in their movements and really feeling like they really had to adhere to rules of propriety around dress and clothing and modesty, slipping into this Lycra leotard and tights and leggings was really freeing. And they showed sweat. That's the other thing too. And whereas for years women had tried to conceal their sweat, now that sweating was the point. And it really marked a shift in the way that women moved. So Gilda's other claim to fame that I mentioned is that she had many famous students, but one who would leave a particularly lasting mark on fitness history. And that's Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda's stepmother, Shirley Fonda, who I think was about 5 years older than her, was a regular at Gilda's and brought her in. Jane had never really exercised. She did ballet. She's been very open in speaking about her eating disorders. She was obsessed with being thin, but she hadn't exercised. And then she injured her foot on the set of the China Syndrome and wanted to keep moving. She's talked about how for her ballet was the one time where she felt this kind of tenuous connection to her body and her strength. And these classes, they were able to modify them so that she could participate, and she just fell in love. So she was an exercise student at Gilda Marx's studio, and at the same time, she was married to Tom Hayden, the political activist, and they were looking for a way to fund his PAC, the Campaign for Economic Democracy. And she was trying to figure out what she could do other than acting. And she was already, she was already donating, giving a lot of her money, her income to his cause. And at this point, too, she had already won an Oscar for Klute. She was equally revered and reviled for her Vietnam activism. But she thought, what do I know? Well, I know exercise. I love exercise. So she opened a studio in Beverly Hills, and she's there. That's the first day of the studio's opening. And the way when I talk to people who've lived this history, contemporaries and other aerobics pioneers, they really talk about women's fitness history as BJ and AJ, before Jane and after Jane. Many people, I think, would assume that the women's fitness history kind of starts with Jane Fonda. And that is because So her studio was an instant success. I mean, imagine if today one of the world's biggest, most famous actresses and personalities was showing up at a studio to teach you a class. But she was commissioned to write her workout book, which became a massive bestseller. And then she was approached not long after to make a video. The book came out in 1981, and the video was 1982. And at first she said, no. She said, I've written my book. I have a record of nobody I know owns a VCR. And it was true. VCRs were new. They were prohibitively expensive. The tapes were prohibitively expensive. And no one really understood why you'd need to own a movie so that you would watch it. Like, why did you need to watch a movie more than, a couple times? But she decided, okay, it'll be more money for the Campaign for Economic Democracy. And she made the video. And as it started to catch on, it's now credited basically with not only starting the home fitness industry, but really kickstarting the home entertainment industry, the home video industry at large. Because suddenly, if you wanted to benefit from the workout, you needed to own it, and you needed to own a VCR. And so it went on to sell 17 million copies, and of course she made many, many more videos after that first one, and was the best-selling home video of all time for a very long time. And it really helped to, while there was still obviously a cost involved and a privilege, it helped to kind of democratize women's fitness. It spread it on a level that we hadn't seen before. Jazzercise and aerobics were similar, but now women could also work out in the privacy of their homes, of their living rooms. They could do it while their kids were napping. It just made it really accessible. By the late 80s, there were 500 workout videos being produced every year. And if you were a celebrity, you probably had a workout video. My favorite, I think, Angela Lansbury's and Debbie Reynolds. If you haven't, after this, I would recommend going on YouTube. They are really delightful. So I'm consolidating history a little bit as we move toward the end. But by the 90s, women were starting to feel burnt out. They had felt the burn, and they were tired, and they were getting older. And in some cases, they had experienced injuries from so much high impact aerobics with little exercise science. And so it was in that moment that yoga really started to rise in this country. Of course, yoga has a history that goes back millennia. It had even been, it had a loyal following in the U.S. going back to the 30s. But it was in that moment that the country, it was basically kind of the collective deep breath that the country needed. And to a lesser extent, but in the same vein, Pilates also started to take off in the 90s for the same reason. And so it really helped to plant this seed for women that fitness didn't have to mean going to this big gym and working your body to exhaustion. It could mean going to a small, simple place, a simple studio, and breathing and, moving in gentler ways. But in that moment, it helped to also this is where we trace back the beginnings of boutique fitness as we know it today. These standalone studios that again are focused on one thing. So this pretty much, I'm jumping ahead to the present, but it was from there that we saw the kind of line that takes us into where we are today. And again, there's so much more I could say about this history, but I will leave that for the book. I will say consider today that more women run road races than men. Women are filling up CrossFit gyms, and interest in women's sports and athletics is at a high. I wanted to also just pause and acknowledge that I was really surprised in my research to discover that this is a very Jewish history. This was a piece that the foreword did on the book, and Alma also featured it. Many of the pioneers of this movement, including some I didn't even speak to today, were Jewish. Lottie Berg, of course, Gilda Marks, Hinda Miller, Lisa Lyon, Lucille Roberts, who started a line of gyms in the New York area called Lucille Roberts, was a Soviet Jewish refugee, and she built this empire. And so I've thought a lot about, is there any, why? What does this mean, And I think it might have something to do with the Jewish people's sort of comfort with reinvention and being so good at reinvention, and which is something exercise promises at its core. I think there's something to be said as a Jewish woman and feeling safe in your body and feeling strong. And I want to believe that maybe some women saw it as a form of tikkun olam, but I'd be curious for your thoughts on this as well. So, a few final thoughts to leave you with. The first chapter of my book is titled Reduce, which, of course, at the time, reduce was a euphemism for losing weight. And the last chapter of my book is titled Expand. And for me, that word holds multiple meanings. It means expanding our idea of what a fit body looks like beyond what many of the women in this presentation looked like, beyond youngish, thin, white, upper middle class women. It means expanding access to movement, so more people have the time and the safe space and the resources to enjoy the benefits of physical activity. And it means expanding our understanding of what fitness can offer us. Again, beyond just shaping your figure to offering a source of mental health and joy and community. And so my larger hope with this book was that by pulling back the curtain on some of these social and cultural forces that have shaped the industry and the way that we move and the way that these women forge their careers, we can move beyond those forces and start to tap into and harness movement in a way that can truly liberate all women, as I say. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess I wasn't talking into the mic. This was fascinating. I'd like to open it up to questions, but I'd like to ask the first one, if you don't mind.
Of course.
I'm just curious. You're the first woman that you presented, her name was Bonnie
Pruden.
Mm-hmm. When she went to Washington and talked about exercise, I mean, she was not just impacting women, she was impacting men as well.
Right.
So would you say that she was also a pioneer for all people, not just women?
Yes.
Yeah, it was pretty remarkable that women started this whole fitness movement.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah, she changed. Again, this book could be like 3,000 pages, and she made it possible for everyone to move. Like
Thank you. So questions anyone like to ask? About your own exercise, your own relationship to exercise. Okay, here we go.
Hi. I remember, my name's Rusty.
Hi.
I remember in the 50s sitting in the gym and watching the boys go up and down the rope, but not the girls. And I've been at my grandchildren's school and watched them do everything except stand on their heads.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful thing to see exactly what you're talking about, how things have changed. And it's all for the better for everybody. To use our bodies and to know that our bodies can move. And I think the older we get, the more important it is for us that our bodies move. So I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's thanks to Bonnie Pruden, again, that women are doing that. That girls, I should say, are doing that. In her era, it used to be that girls were only allowed to run half the court. They were only allowed to play half-court basketball if they were allowed to play at all. And again, that was out of fear. So things have changed for the better.
Okay, a question over here. I'll get to you in a second.
Thanks, Linda. So I was struck by so many of the pictures showed a woman with the legs straight up. And I'm a daily exerciser. I'm in really good shape, but I've never once been able to do that with the leg, straight like that. Did you pick pictures specifically like that, or was that something that the fitness industry tried to show as what would be the best that a person could be?
That's such a great question. I certainly did not intentionally choose those pictures, but I will say that, yeah, in going through the archives, there are so many images of these leaders in that position, and part of it was because they were dancers. They had a background in dance. They were naturally flexible, and I think there was a wow factor. I'm sure there was a subliminal message of sexuality conveyed as well, and so all of these women were really smart marketers, and whether they were conscious of it or not, they kind of, I think, knew what would help to sell their product. So I'm going to take a closer look now at what I chose to include.
Okay, question from your family over here.
You said there were 2 women at the presidential summit. Who was the other one?
Hold on a second.
Maybe you don't know.
She was a golfer, and her name was Barbara Romack. So she was a professional golfer, which was a sport that was pretty accepted for women at that time. Yeah.
Question over here.
I don't really have a question. I am a daily exerciser as well. I just found it so interesting because I kind of thought, and I'm 68, I thought it all started with Jane Fonda. Mm-hmm. So to me, this is just really enlightening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Want to share some of your own history?
Sorry. So throughout the presentation, I was thinking about that John Travolta and Jamie Lee Curtis movie. Remember?
Of course.
Perfect, right? From 1985. And it's about a reporter who goes to report on this new fitness craze, everything, and ends up falling for the Jamie Lee Curtis, the aerobics instructor. Did you rewatch that as you were writing this book? What kind of intersection did you see in the popular culture, too? So you showed some toys for girls, but there were also movies like that, not just the fitness videos, but what other movies, or did you consider that popular culture bent that physical fitness took as well?
Oh, very, very much, yes. So that movie, Perfect, was actually the magazine, the Rolling Stone cover I showed with Christy Brinkley, Searching for Mr. Goodbody. That was the inspiration behind that movie. I mean, it was basically adapted from that story. Yeah, I did rewatch that movie. It's a pretty funny reflection of the time. But the 80s really became, I mean, I looked at every decade, but fitness was just culturally so huge in the 80s. And I think, there are some reasons for that beyond what I shared. Just baby boomers starting to inch closer to middle age and wanting to hold on to youth, and Ronald Reagan and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and there was so for me, and this is throughout the book. I mean, that was as a pop culture lover, I really enjoyed seeing the interplay and the way that the rise of fitness culture influenced pop culture and vice versa. And probably one of the biggest influences in both directions was the namesake of my book, Olivia Newton-John's song Physical, which later Billboard listed as like the top pop song of the 80s. And there's a whole funny story there too, where it wasn't originally supposed to be about exercise, but she was a little shy, so she turned it into a double entendre. But yeah, from leotards to the music to, there were other movies as well from that era, Flashdance, and even strictly dance-based movies like A Chorus Line helped to fuel interest in aerobics. I found those interconnections and those kind of hidden connections to be really fun and fascinating, and they are. I tried to pepper them throughout the book.
Question.
Sort of a little shared history. So I was born in 1958, and until I was in 6th grade, I was not allowed to wear pants to school. So
I'm her sister, and I couldn't wear pants until 12th grade.
Wow.
But I was thinking about the fact that when we went out for recess in elementary school, we ran around in our skirts. I loved to run, I loved to move, and we would climb the monkey bars, and the boys would look up our skirts all of the time. And nobody thought anything of it. I mean, the teachers saw it, they did nothing. But my real query is, I'm wondering now, what made the change? Like, why did the school administrators suddenly decide that it was okay for us to wear pants during the day? I'm wondering which came first, the chicken or the egg. You know, did this impact school boards and parents, or the other way around? And I don't know if that came up in your research at all.
Yeah, a little bit. I definitely heard a lot of stories about what people had to wear in gym class. There were a lot of stories of bloomers, rompers. I don't know, I know at some point I did look into more of the contemporary history of pants on campuses, but now I would need to go back and refresh my memory. But I do think it just shows it's like there again the focus on traditional femininity and on appearing feminine, especially if you were moving, I think was really powerful. And so, women often were not the winners in that. We're not the winners in that equation. So it persisted for a long time.
I have another question that came to mind regarding women in the Boston Marathon. At that time, women were not allowed to run marathons anywhere around the country, or just that particular?
They were not allowed to officially run marathons anywhere.
So it took from 67 to 72.
Yes.
And was there a lot of pushback by men in the country to allow women?
So from what I heard, the pushback was among officials. Many of the men who were running alongside these women were like, this is, they were supportive. I wish my wife would run with me, Also, I mean, running itself at that time it was still considered in the 60s, running just for fun and running long distances like that for recreation was still considered a little kooky, So I think they saw these women as their own. But yeah, I mean, it took 5 years of advocating to get the race to open to women, and Catherine organized a number of races that were co-ed after that first experience, and it was just like having to prove again and again that women were not keeling over. And the other thing that always I'm still like I can't get over is that the Olympics did not host a women's marathon event until 1984. Because of both fears around what it could do to women's bodies and, this belief that there wasn't interest. There weren't enough women who wanted to compete. So women would often compete in these male-only races. They would participate, but they were called like ghost competitors because there would be no official record of them participating.
Any other questions up over here? How are we doing on time? We're doing okay on time?
Yeah, I hesitated to bring this up. I was in high school in the late 50s in the rural South. Mm-hmm. And being athletic was a big thing. I mean, we had a great girls' basketball team. We had competition with neighboring teams. And I remember someone who was revered as a great track star. Now, she didn't run with guys, but there was, I don't remember, I mean, we all took dancing lessons. I don't remember any hesitation about, having muscles. People admired these wonderful athletes. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'm from Atlanta. I'm from the South as well. But throughout my research, I heard stories like yours too. I think there were pockets, there were communities that were supportive of women's strength and families that were. So much, if a community was supportive of women being active, then it would become more normalized and more accepted. But women would still usually hit a bit of a wall once they got to college, like scholarship money for these athletes. There were track meets, and there were women who ran. Again, they did still in other places face, this kind of discrimination, and the races tended to be short. But it's not like sports didn't exist for women. It just it was curtailed, it was limited, especially pre-Title IX. And then, yeah, it was often once, you know, you graduated out of these programs, then you were a bit more on your own. But there was also, like, there have always been sports that have been a little bit more acceptable for women: tennis, horseback riding, swimming, dancing. And so that, again, those still not everyone had access to, but they existed. It was just in a much more limited capacity. And you had to hide your sweat.
So thank you. Any other questions? Oh, one more.
I just have a quick comment. I remember my mother and her mother, my grandmother, in the 1950s, being on a TV show in the Cleveland area called Paige Palmer, where they exercised in leotards, and then later doing it in our living room, and I'm just sharing that. I don't know if that was mentioned earlier.
I love that. No, I don't think Paige Palmer came up in my research. But yeah, there, you know, in the 60s, that was when Bonnie Pruden eventually got her own TV show, The Bonnie Pruden Show. The Jack LaLanne Show was really huge. I actually just I had the opportunity to spend time with, and then I wrote a profile of his wife, Elaine LaLanne, yeah, who's 97. That was mine, yeah, thank you. And so there were, you know, and then there were local programs like this, and they were, you know, well, on one hand, they were often very focused on, like, it was, you know, they were targeting stay-at-home moms and housewives, saying, put down your mop and move with us, and, you know, work off your love handles. But they also, I sort of take it off, you know, I appreciate progress where I see it, and they were really, you know, considered pretty progressive for just encouraging women to move like that. And those leotards they were wearing, though, again, were cotton and not necessarily so supportive, but it was a start.
Your book and presentation today certainly has opened up a whole discussion. I would love to sit around a round table and talk about our own personal history of exercise. I mean, me personally, I remember I really didn't get into exercise till I was pregnant with my first child, and I joined the Y. I don't remember there being any real fitness centers. I never thought about it, and I just started swimming at the Y. But I'm sure we all have stories of our own relationship to how we got into exercise. And yeah, at this point in our lives, you talked about yoga, Pilates. I think as we get older, we turn to these other forms of stretching, maintaining our body health. Anyway, I want to thank you so very much. I am so excited to share this book. Danielle's going to be outside signing books. If you don't have one, go purchase one. I'm going to purchase a number of them for my friends and family.
Thank you.
And thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me and for the great questions. It's been really fun.
I didn't leave anything up here, so just maybe that's your water, my water?
Yeah.
Thank you. This was really great.
I know. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't know her. Cooper, okay.
SCW.
Yeah.